Hello there, and welcome back to Daddy Roll the One. I'm Martin, and this is part 2 in my 2-part series on the history of alignment and the planar cosmology in the game of Dungeons and Dragons. Really quickly to recap what we went over in part 1, we talked about the history of alignment in the game and why it was even included in the first place. We talked about how Gary Gygax had written some war games prior to the release of Dungeons and Dragons in 1974. He wrote a few different games that included the concept of alignment, and we talked about why that was and why he included that, and then how it influenced him to include it when he and Dave Arneson were creating the game of Dungeons and Dragons as we know it today. We talked about how alignment is very directly tied to the concept of the planes, and we went over some of the early development of the planar cosmology and how we got to this concept called the Great Wheel, which was used pretty much throughout the history of Dungeons and Dragons until 4th edition, but which we've come back to now again in 5th edition. So I do encourage you to watch that video first before you watch this one, as a lot of the concepts that we're going to be talking about here were first introduced in that part 1. So there's a link here in the upper right-hand corner. Really quickly, in this video, what we're going to be talking about is the expansion of the planes that originally appeared in what was a magazine article in Dragon Magazine, but then it was later reprinted in the 1978 Player's Handbook. However, that was quickly expanded, and we're going to go over that very briefly, and then talk about the first planar adventure that was written and published by TSR. And then we're going to jump into the 1987 Manual of the Planes, and that's going to be the core of what we're going to be talking about here, because that book really ended up developing and codifying the planar cosmology that we still use today in 5th edition. Then after that, very, very briefly, I'm going to go over some of the stuff that happened between 2nd and 5th edition after that Manual of the Planes was released, and talk about some things that were introduced over time. Okay, so with that, then let's jump to 1980. So this is 2 years after the release of the Player's Handbook and that introduction in the Player's Handbook of the planes of existence and the planar cosmology. Then you have Deities and Demigods. There were 2 different versions of this book released. This is the second printing, so this is the one that has the Cthulhu and the Melnibonian mythos. And if you're confused by that, please watch my video on the history of all 18 Dungeons and Dragons Advanced first edition hardbacks, and you'll understand what I'm talking about. But in this book, in the back, this presents information on the planar cosmology, and a lot of it is repeating what we saw in the Player's Handbook, but it's also expanding and developing on it. So just a couple quick things here that they're talking about. It gets into the ethereal plane, and then right underneath it, it talks about the plane of shadow and how the plane of shadow coexists with the prime material plane, and is a result of the interaction of that plane and the positive and negative material planes. This was not in the Player's Handbook, so that this is in this book. It's where it's developed. Then you see here the elemental planes: air, fire, earth, and water. However, you see these intersections. Again, not something that was gone into detail in the Player's Handbook. Remember these names: ice, dust, heat, and vapor. They're going to come up later. Okay, but you just have this expansion, a lot of the same diagrams, but it's just expanded from what we saw in the Player's Handbook. Also, a very early adventure that came out by TSR, the company, again, that was publishing Dungeons and Dragons at the time, is this one, Q1. This is part of a series, kind of could be considered the first adventure path. There were 7 modules total. There was G, 1, 2, and 3, the Giant series, followed by D, 1, 2, and 3, the Drow series. And then this was the capstone, Q1, Queen of the Demon Web Pits. What's interesting about this is it's a planar adventure. So the characters go to the abyss, and they have adventures there. And this goes into what happens when you're adventuring on the abyss, and how it alters things like your spells, your clerical spells, your magic user spells, and your druidical spells. So how adventuring on the plane affects that. This was very, very early on. Okay, then we talked about before some of the magazine articles that had been written, but the core of this video is going to be going over this book. So after you have all the stuff in the very, very early 80s, you have articles being written in Dragon Magazine. A lot of that information is then taken, such as the article Roger Moore wrote in Dragon number 67 on the Astral Plane. You have articles written by Ed Greenwood, Dragon number 75 and 76. about the Nine Hells. You have articles written in Dragon number 90 by Roger Moore, again, on Gladsheim, the home plane to the Norse gods. So a lot of that information ends up being pulled into this book, The Manual of the Planes, released in 1987. This was, again, one of the last books released in the first edition, or what we now call first edition, although it doesn't say that because there were no editions at the time. 1987. Second edition is going to come out in 1989. But this book is really going to dive whole hog into the planes and how to adventure on the planes. That's what this book is mainly about. And one of the things that we're going to notice as we go through this book is there's not a lot of mechanics in this book. It's mostly lore. It's mostly talking about the planes and how they interact with each other. It does go a little bit into how your character's abilities are going to change when you're adventuring on each plane. But by and large, this was written to be sort of an in-between, because as this was being written, second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons was already under development. And they knew that if they had a book that came out in 1987, they wanted to continue selling it in 1989 after the new edition was released. So this was written with the understanding that players could still use it with the new edition. So just jumping in really quickly, this goes into all the different planes. And it's really just discussing them, ethereal, inner planes, going through all the different inner planes. But then it gets into para-elemental planes, which are new, quasi-elemental planes, the astral plane, and then the outer planes. So again, you've got your diagrams and schematics of how the different planes work together. You have spell summaries of different kind of spells that they're going to refer to, and they're giving you like levels and what kind of classes can cast them. And then they jump into the ethereal plane. Okay, so it talks about the ethereal plane, the different kinds of creatures that you might encounter there when you're adventuring, gets into combat and how that changes, and then it goes over again the spells. Now, this is going to be a pattern we're going to be seeing repeated in this book over and over again. How do spellcaster spells change when they are on this particular plane? Then it goes into the demi-planes of the ethereal. Now, one of those we've already talked about, which is the plane of shadow. That was in that Deities and Demigods book that we just talked about a few minutes ago. But this also introduces the demi-plane of time, electromagnetism, and imprisonment. So they're expanding. This is expanding our concept of what we think of as the planes. Demi-planes are a big thing. They continue into 5th edition. There are still demi-planes. And that concept was kind of, I don't want to say it started here because it did start in Deities and Demigods when they talked about the plane of shadow, but it's expanded here. Then you get into your inner planes, which are mostly made up of the elemental planes, but you also have the positive and negative energy planes. But you've got earth and air and fire and water. And this just goes into all of that. Again, you've got your encounters, you've got how magic changes. It also goes into how your player character abilities change. This is a fun artifact of the time period because this is post 1985's Unearthed Arcana. Again, see that video on the history of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons hardbacks to learn more about that. But 3 new character classes had been introduced in that game, which were the Cavalier, the Barbarian, and the Thief Acrobat split class. And so you'll see Barbarians and Cavaliers listed in here as to how those classes change when they're adventuring on this plane and what abilities work and which ones don't. Then we jump into chapters for each, or sections for each elemental plane: air, earth, fire, water. Okay. But then you get to this section called the para-elemental planes. Now, this is fun because it's talking about the interaction between those 2 planes. So we saw that first developed in Deities and Demigods, but then you see it repeated here. So you have the paraplanes, smoke, magma, ooze, and ice. These are different than the ones that we saw in Deities and Demigods. So smoke is between air and fire, magma is between fire and earth, ooze is between water and earth, and then ice is between water and air. Okay, so it talks all about that and then some of the kind of creatures that you would find there. But notice this also, they're starting to talk about the positive and negative poles or energy planes that interact with these different elemental planes. So here you see, there's earth, ooze, and water. We talked about that already. But then you see with positive plane, when it interacts with earth, it has the quasi-plane of minerals. When the positive plane interacts with water, you have the quasi-plane of steam. With air, it's lightning, and with fire, it's radiance. Now, radiance is kind of the big one from here. This gets used over and over again. It gets changed. It's not always a quasi-plane, but the plane of radiance is something that comes up over time in the game as we move forward. You also have a similar concept, but with negative. So you've got dust with earth, ash with fire, vacuum with air, and salt with water. So, more negative than these kind of more fun ones over here. So more detail on the quasi-elemental planes. And then the Astral Plane. Now, remember, there was a huge article written in Dragon Magazine, number 67. So you see this section on the Astral Plane, and it goes on for quite a bit. That's more than you get in most of these other planes. Okay, then we get into the Astral Planes, which there are a ton of them. And this is aligned with the alignment, but they tie into the alignments. But you'll see it's not alignment as we think of it, because Gary does these kind of half steps. So you have lawful neutrals, but then you have neutral good lawfuls, neutral good lawfuls, neutral goods, neutral good chaotics. So he's doing these things to kind of say, like, it's not just cut and dried. You could be neutral good, but have chaotic tendencies, or you could be neutral good and have lawful tendencies, or conversely, you could be lawful good and have neutral tendencies. So he kind of goes into all of that here. And these are the outer planes. Now, a lot of these planes have changed their names. So if you see here, for example, the Happy Hunting Grounds are now known as the Beast Lands, but it's the same thing. That's what this was originally, the Happy Hunting Grounds. So a lot of these have kind of had their names tweaked a little bit over time. The Concordant Opposition, we now call the Outlands, and I'll get into that in a second. So goes into your outer planes. And then at the end of that, there's just some appendices. It talks about prime material planes and including alternate material planes in your game if you want to, and what that would mean. You've got some creatures here for the different planes, abilities, and powers, and that's it. That's the 1987 Manual of the Planes. So what's interesting about this really defines how we look at the planes now. A lot of the things that you saw in there, if you're a 5th edition player, you probably recognize a lot of those, and that's because this concept of the Great Wheel, which actually predates this, it really goes back to, it was 1975 or 1976, that article in Dragon Magazine number 8 that we talked about, where that was outlined by Gary Gygax prior to the release of the Player's Handbook in 1978. But we're using a Planar Cosmology in 5th edition that has its roots in something that is not quite 50 years old, but it's close. It's, 45, let's say. So we have Manual of the Planes. Now, after this, 1989, you have the release of 2nd edition D&D, and the only mention of the planes at the time was in the Dungeon Master's Guide. You see here, it's a short 2-page spread, and it's not even the full 2 pages, and it just quickly goes over the planes, no detail, and that's it. 1989, you don't get anything else. Players were calling for a revision or an update to the Manual of the Planes. TSR finally accommodates that, but not quite how people expected. Rather than doing an update to Manual of the Planes, they decided to do a campaign setting called Planescape. It was a box set. This is the box set here. Now, Planescape really could be its own video, and it probably should be. So this is just going to be a quick summary. But the idea of this was, it is a campaign setting designed for planar cosmology, plane hopping, essentially. So rather than going to the dungeon and doing exploration in the dungeon, you're exploring the planes. So it's a very different kind of concept. The art was completely different from the art that we see in earlier editions of D&D, and was frankly one of the things that really kind of helped solidify this in the aesthetic of the time period. We also have the creation in here of a city called Sigil. So think of Sigil as the equivalent of a tavern in a standard fantasy role-playing game. A standard like a Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms. Sigil is your tavern. It's where you're going to meet all the different kinds of people. It sits in the Outlands, which again is the neutral plane, used to be called the Concordant Opposition. They changed the name to the Outlands for this. And from there, you can explore all the different planes. And that was key to this particular setting. You needed a place where people could meet and get rumors and meet with people and hire people or whatever they needed to do, and a place from which to start their adventures. So that's the city of Sigil. Another thing that happened in this game that was very, very clever, when this game came out, or this campaign setting came out, something that was very popular at the time was a game called Vampire the Masquerade. And that game came out in the early 90s, and it kind of redefined role-playing. It was very different from a standard dungeon crawl that Dungeons and Dragons was known for. And there were many players that might not have even ever played Dungeons and Dragons, but they were getting into Vampire the Masquerade. And one of the key elements that people related to in Vampire was the concept of these clans. Vampire clans are almost like families that manipulated against each other. They fought against each other. It was political. It was very role-playing heavy. And you would associate with a particular vampire clan when you created your character. TSR wanted something like that for D&D because that didn't really exist too much. And so they created this concept of factions in Sigil. And originally there were 16 of them in the Planescape campaign setting. And that was their answer to the clans from Vampire the Masquerade. So it's just kind of like a fun little aside. So that is a quick overview of Planescape. Unfortunately, it came out late, came out in 1994. Wizards of the Coast ends up buying TSR in 1998, and then they revised the game for 3rd edition in 2000. So the Planescape setting had a very limited time window. It was about 4 to 5 years because it stopped, I think, publishing new material around 1998. So then you have the release of this book for 3rd edition, D&D 2001. This is the Manual of the Planes. It's really kind of just restating a lot of the stuff that we saw in the 1987 Manual of the Planes. It's going over a lot of the same planes, material and transitive planes and inner planes, outer planes. You'll see some of these planes have changed names, but they're still kind of the same idea. You've got your demi planes here. And it has some monsters. And then it gets into variant planes. So here you see very specifically, I'll point this out for 5e players, the Far Realm. That was originally part of a module or adventure that came out in association with the Planescape campaign setting from 2nd edition. But here you see it jump into a core rule book. Also, you see here the Plane of Fairy. That's eventually going to become the Feywild in 4th edition, but they start introducing the concept here. So that's this particular book. This one has, it's got the same kind of cosmology, that same great wheel. It's just some of the planes have been renamed. The 3.5 edition of the game has the Planar Handbook. So this is just an update to that book you just saw, but it's much more player focused. So it goes into like different character classes and has new spells and feats and all that kind of thing. New races that are specific to the 3.5 edition of the game. There's actually very little in here on the actual planes. I mean, it's a little less than half the book, but because you could still use the old Manual of the Planes with 3.5. Then in 4th edition, Planes move to the Dungeon Master's Guide again. And in this particular one, so this is probably the biggest change since the introduction of the game. When you get into the planes, which comes at the end of the book, they start talking about a new cosmology here. So you have elemental chaos and the abyss and the astral sea. It's not the Great Wheel. So it's completely changed. That was a big change for 4th edition. And then later on, and you'll see it's not even that long, later on in 4th edition is where you're going to get things like the Shadowfell, which was the old Plane of Shadow. You're going to get the Feywild introduced. That comes here in 4th edition, which then gets revamped when you get to 5th edition. So 5th edition kind of backtracks, and that's very consistent with the core idea of this game. This was trying to go back to the original version of the game to recapture some players that had left during 4th. But the Planar Cosmology in this book that is introduced toward the end of the book, and I showed this in my previous video, but when they get into the Planar Cosmology here, they're revamping it back to the Great Wheel, but they do include stuff from 4th edition like the Feywild and the Shadowfell. So that's it for a look at the history of alignment and planes in Dungeons and Dragons. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, share it on social media, and leave me a comment and let me know what you liked or didn't like. And I will see you next time.